Hey guys, today we are in First Corinthians chapter 11. So in this, he's writing to particular situations that are going on in the Corinth church. And so we get to verse 1, he says, "Be imitators of me as I am in Christ." That actually goes back to chapter 10, chapter 9, chapter 8, chapter 7, where he's saying, you have freedoms, but be like me, right? Don't use your freedoms just because you can, but think of others and think of God. So be an imitator of me as I've given up my freedoms and my liberties so that you would know the gospel. So verse 1 goes with the other chapters. But then in verse 2, we start this idea of head coverings. And there's a lot to be said in head coverings and the Lord's Supper in this chapter. So I'm going to skip a lot. If you have questions, feel free to ask. But I'm just going to sum up these two issues, okay? In these two issues, once again, he's writing to a particular church at a particular time at a particular problem. The first problem is that men are acting like women and women are acting like men. Can you imagine that would happen? Yes, right? Nothing is new under the sun, right? And so what's happening? And so what's happening in this in the first 16 verses of chapter 11 talks about head coverings. And it starts simply with verse 3. The verse 3 is the principle that Paul is trying to teach. But I want you to understand that the head or the ruling of every man is Christ. And the head or the ruling of a wife is her husband. Or you could say a woman over man. It's speaking to both people, married and unmarried. And the head or the ruling of Christ is God. So he's teaching us that there is this hierarchy, this level of leadership. You have God over Christ. You have Christ over man. You have man over woman. This isn't to say that women are worthless. This isn't to say that men have no opinion or women have no opinion. That has nothing to do with this, because we're going to see in just a minute that man and women are equal, okay? But what this is saying is the ruling, this submissiveness, right? So just as Jesus was submissive to God, man should be submissive to Christ, and woman should be submissive to man. Doesn't mean that women are nothing. It doesn't mean that men can beat women. It has nothing to do with that, because Christ doesn't beat man, right? Christ loved man so much that he went to the cross, the same way that man should love his wife. It's the same thing. So it's nothing of evil here. The problem is that men were dressing like women. They were putting a veil on, and it says that then they prayed or they prophesied. Pray is vertical. That's a conversation between man to God. Prophesy is horizontal. That's man to man. So whenever a man would pray, he would put on a woman's veil. Whenever a man would preach or tell people about God, he would put on a veil. A man was dressing up like a woman. The same that as women, anytime that a woman would pray, she would remove her veil, saying that she was basically dressing like a man. Or that she was talking about God with another woman, she would remove her veil, basically saying she was dressing like a man. And so what happened was there was some role reversal going on, okay? So in this issue of head coverings, it is not to say that you have to wear a veil, okay? In Corinth, there was a problem that was going on. Back then, women wanted to be men, men wanted to be women. They were role reversing. So the women were acting like men, and the men were acting like women when it come to church, and when it came to praying, and when it came to leadership, ruling, submissiveness in their spiritual life, right? And so Paul just says that women should dress like women. They should wear veils. Men should dress like men, right? They should not wear veils. He was not giving us a principle that is to be used today. Sometimes you will see there's many churches where women have to cover their heads. that women will not cut their hair, okay? This is a principle for a particular place at a particular time for a particular group of people. Basically, in the head coverings, Paul's just writing and says, just as Jesus submitted to God, man submits to Christ, and women submits to man. And that's the principle that he's laying out. And that's why we're talking about this head covering. As it goes on to a new problem, starting in verse 17, we have a problem not just of submissiveness, but of the Lord's Supper. And we see at the very beginning, verse 17 through 22, the perversion of it. What was happening was when they was coming to doing the Lord's Supper, okay, they weren't doing the Lord's Supper as we do the Lord's Supper. They were doing it as a meal, okay? We can see in verse 20, when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. That word Lord's Supper, supper is the word given there, is that we would call our evening meal, right? It's just saying the Lord's everyday meal. People were coming together and just eating supper. And while they were eating supper, they were gouging themselves and gorging themselves and eating everything that they had. You had poor people in the church that was coming expecting to get a little bit of the wealthy people's food, but the wealthy people were gorging themselves and eating everything and not sharing it. They were not fellowshipping. They were not koinoneing, sharing amongst one another for the glory of God. They were only making themselves full of food and drink and did not care about anybody else. So Paul says, what are you doing? If you're going to do that, just stay at home and eat in your house and drink in your house and do those things. But when we come together, the purpose of the Lord's Supper, starting in verse 23, is what? And we see an interesting line that probably many of you haven't thought of. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus Christ, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread. As we read the New Testament, we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians. So in our mind, we think 1 Corinthians came later. 1 Corinthians was really the first letter, the first writing that the church has about what the Lord's Supper is. The Gospels were written chronologically in time after 1 Corinthians. So here Paul says, when I received, this is the first biblical account of the Lord's Supper. And so here he's saying, I'm telling you we should do the Lord's Supper. Here's what it is, because Jesus told me. Jesus told me what it was. On the night of his betrayal, the historical setting, right? As we know it because we have the Gospels, but remember, they don't have the Gospels. And so on the night before he went to the cross, what happened, right? He took the bread, the Passover bread, the bread of Exodus, and he broke it. And he said, this is my body. This is my incarnate body, which is for you. Do this in the remembrance of me. This is a command. And in the same way, he took the cup, the blood of the Passover, saying, this is the cup of the new covenant of grace, and this is my blood. Do this as often. Remember, no frequency giving. Paul doesn't say you have to do it so many times. Just as often as you do this, as often as you come together to remember the cross of the Christ, do this in the remembrance of Jesus. And so Paul is simply writing to the church, and he says, when you guys are coming to do the Lord's Supper, you're not doing the Lord's Supper. You're just eating fat. You're getting fat. You're eating all your food. You're getting drunk. You're doing this, and you're saying you're doing it for Jesus, but you only care about yourself. And what happens? Because of that's happening, you're not doing, starting in verse 27, you're not preparing to take the Lord's Supper. He said that if you come in an unworthy manner, that word unworthy manner means ritualistic. If you just come to say, hey, I'm doing the Lord's Supper, it's just a ritual, it's a thing that we do, there's going to be disrespect or guilty concerning the body. There's going to be some sin issues there, because we're supposed to self-examine, make sure that we're ready to receive the Lord's Supper. And those who do not receive the Lord's Supper, notice what happened. God is judging them. Now, when it says the word judgment there, it's the word krima, and it means chastisement. It doesn't mean that they're going to hell. They're Christians. They're just taking the Lord's Supper wrong. They're taking it ritualistically. They're taking it just to eat and to get drink. They're saying they're doing holy things when they're not doing holy things. And God is judging for this. And even though God doesn't permanently judge, send someone to hell, a Christian, send them to hell, he is sending a punishment. And that punishment is they're getting physically weak. They're getting physically ill. Notice this, even some Christians died because they are taking the Lord's Supper in a wrong manner. Not only are they taking the Lord's Supper, but they're leading astray other people and taking away what Jesus did on the cross. And that's the true point of the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is to glorify what Jesus did on the cross for us, and not just to eat a meal and to drink and to get drunk and to gorge ourselves full of food, right? So everything is about glory. So when we take the Lord's Supper wrong, we're stealing glory away from Christ and we're giving it to our stomach, right? And that's the ultimate sin. So when Paul is writing in chapter 11, it's about two issues. Is Christ the ruling figure? Are you submissive to Christ? And secondly, when you come to take the Lord's Supper, are you doing it for his glory or are you doing it for your glory? And so Paul is answering that. And we even see in the last verse, verse 34, so that when you come together, it will not be for judgment. About the other things, I will give directions when I come. When Paul comes back to Corinth, he was planning to come back to Corinth. He has more things to talk about: worship, submissiveness, and even the Lord's Supper. And he says, we'll talk more about this, but he kind of wanted to give them a primer on what is going wrong in the church. I hope that makes sense. I know that was really quick, but there's a whole lot there. If you have questions, feel free to ask, and we will see you tomorrow on chapter 12. God bless.